Greetings to everyone who's joining us today evening. I am Setu, coordinator for the third FAS Young Scholars online seminar series. Welcome to the seventh seminar of this series titled Decentralization, Groundwater Extraction and Agrarian Livelihoods in Rural Tamil Nadu. The Young Scholars seminar series of the Foundation is a platform for young scholars working in the field of agrarian studies to present their work among peers and experts, and a part of the Foundation's consistent efforts to engage and build a research community around agrarian studies. As part of this series, we have had scholars present their work on various aspects of rural society, ranging from labor relations, agricultural production, women's work, technology, environment, and more. Today's seminar explores aspects of agricultural policy with a focus on decentralization and implementation of one particular groundwater extraction policy in Tamil Nadu. I welcome the presenter of today's seminar, Dr. Vani Swarupa Murali, who is currently lecturing at the South Asian Studies Department in the National University of Singapore. Next, I welcome the discussion for today's session, Dr. R. Gopinath, Principal Scientist at the M.S. Swaminathan Research Foundation. He is a seasoned researcher on agrarian relations in the state of Tamil Nadu. Welcome and thank you for joining us, Dr. Gopinath. Next, I welcome Professor Barbara Harris-White, Emeritus Professor at the University of Oxford and the chair of our seminar series since its inception. Welcome, Professor. Lastly, I welcome each of you for joining us today. But I would like to make a note that Professor Barbara is having some connectivity issues. We may not be able to see Professor Barbara today, but I hope that will not be a hindrance to today's session. And without further delay, I invite Professor Barbara to take over the session from now. And apologies for the connectivity issues.
Thank you very much, Setu, and thank you, Rebecca, and everybody at the Foundation who works behind the scenes to organize this seminar. And it's my fault, not your fault, that the connectivity is not great. But if I freeze an image, I think we've established that the sound is okay. Today, we're going to have a very interesting presentation, both on bureaucratic politics and on an expanded conception of what the agrarian economy is. So we welcome this topic very heartily. The rules of the game, which I need to simply rehearse with people, are that Dr. Murali will be invited to talk for about half an hour. Dr. Gopinath will be invited to respond for about 10 minutes. And then I like to open it up to question and answer in the chat. So while the seminar is going on, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. And I will then organize them in order, and sometimes if there are many questions, in bundles. And there may well be many questions this time. Anyway, without further ado, over to you, Vani. We welcome you.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me now share my screen. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vani Murali, and I am currently teaching at the National University of Singapore. I completed my PhD there as well. In this presentation, I hope to build off some of my doctoral research in order to address the question of why farmers who are most vulnerable to climatic fluctuations do little to mitigate them. Now, just to clarify, I use the term mitigate as opposed to adapt or any other term because I look at making the effects of climate change and the already reduced levels of groundwater less severe by using policy to kind of reduce the amount that is extracted in order to increase the longevity of agriculture as a livelihood, which is ultimately in the interest of the farmer. This is opposed to adaptation, for example, which refers to more anticipating the effects of climate change and then taking action to prevent or minimize the effects. So I do it kind of post the fact. I also use this overall research question as the base to explore the broader question of what these farmers' experiences and the overall concept tell us about the process of decentralization in Tamil Nadu. Now, there's a couple of things to unpack here based on what I've just said, right? So first, we need to understand what is the current state of groundwater levels and what are the climate effects that farmers have felt that even prompted this question in the first place. Second, we will speak about the theoretical framework of decentralization and its manifestations in policy implementation. Third, we look at why Tamil Nadu, right? So why Tamil Nadu presents an interesting case for analyzing decentralization. Then I will briefly talk about the overall methodology that was used to conduct this research, and then I will go into some of the empirical findings and link it to some of the broader conclusions. So let's begin with the current state of groundwater levels and the climate effects that farmers have felt, right? So the current state of groundwater levels, as many of you might know, is quite dire, with news headlines such as those that you can see on the screen right now on how bad it is. And just to put this in data, the table on your right shows the average groundwater level as of October 2023 in Tamil Nadu, where the majority of figures in red, right around this side, they kind of show you the rapidly declining groundwater levels.
Sorry, is it only me? I can't see the screen. Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry. Please continue.
Okay. The India Water Resources Information System also studied several stations across various districts in Tamil Nadu and averaged that the current groundwater level is at 18 meters, down from 11 meters in 2018. And of course, this figure varies drastically from district to district, as you can see, of course, from this figure on your right. But overall, from 2011, you can kind of see that the groundwater levels have been declining year on year. Now, keeping in mind the groundwater recharge and extraction figures, the average stage of groundwater extraction is currently at 82.93%, with some districts crossing the 100% mark. And what this crossing 100% mark means is that residents of these districts are extracting more and quicker than is recharged. And to kind of put all this data a little bit more empirically, let me introduce you to Mrs. Nachiammal, one of the farmers that I interviewed in the Tiruvallur district. And we'll keep coming back to her story because it's quite a fascinating one. But basically, when I interviewed her and I asked her about the challenges that she has faced with groundwater, she shared that at one point there was no water, so we had to stop farming for 10 to 12 years. My father couldn't get money and continue farming beyond a certain point. Over time, as the ground was recharged with water, she's now back to farming in her plot of land where she owns 5 acres and rents another 5 acres. I visited her again after the cyclone Mandus, and then she shared that the paddy sown in September of that year was all destroyed due to the cyclone, meaning that the expected produce and money from this season are all nil. Now, Mrs. Nachiammal's experiences could have been mitigated, through the government policy that I will talk about shortly, which is on microirrigation. But when asked, she said those who use, microirrigation schemes like sprinkler and drip are water-scarce regions like Madurai down south. There's a lot of water here, so we can just pump from the ground, right? Now, we can already draw from this that there was a scheme in place that could have helped mitigate the 10 to 12 years that Mrs. Nachiammal had to stop farming. B, that the effects of climate change and groundwater levels are indeed quite dire. And C, that there is a gap between policy creation and reception or knowledge of the policy on the ground. And this is precisely where the concept of decentralization comes in. Now, the popularity of decentralization theory grew quite significantly in the 90s to kind of counter inefficient and ineffective governance, macroeconomic instability, and inadequate growth that resulted from excessive centralization of government control over the agricultural sector. Instead, decentralization encouraged state withdrawal and facilitated local governance after the economic liberalization processes took off in many countries. This trend also stemmed out of the growing disillusionment with the centralized state, its capacity and its legitimacy, as well as a growing need from individuals that necessitated local structures that were focused on quick and effective service delivery. Now, of course, with any theory, there are proponents and opponents. So let me quickly talk through some of the pros and cons of decentralization as a theory before I clarify on where my research situates itself. So in the list of pros, we've already talked about one, but just to build on that, John Stuart Mill, he suggested that national and local domains would benefit from greater local participation. Rondinelli, another scholar who works on decentralization, listed 14 potential benefits, including cutting through red tape, increased efficiency, and quicker implementation of development programs. Other political theorists argued that decentralization would lead to a more effective and efficient local governance structure that is responsive, transparent, and accountable. Several scholarly interventions also suggested that the spatial proximity would give subnational governments better insight into local communities and would therefore be able to construct policies according to local needs, demands, and preferences. And bringing the government closer to the people also implied empowered, transparent, informed and democratic local decision-making, better identification of local needs, accountable and responsive governance, active citizen participation, and an overall better access to the state's policy framework for the people. Overall, a lot of the literature has emphasized the potential of decentralization to improve the distribution, access, and quality of public goods, and also the idea of bringing decision-making and service delivery closer to the people, especially those belonging to poor and vulnerable groups. Now, coming to the list of cons on this side, with decentralization, theoretically, there would be limited opportunity for corruption to take root due to the accountability and closeness to the ground that was mentioned earlier. However, critics of this argument have highlighted the importance of underlying power structures in village communities that could take precedence over the formal process of decentralization. Similarly, interviews with farmers in Tamil Nadu revealed that they often had to play into the hands of bribery in order to get their produce or crops sold quickly, rather than waiting for the government process to unfold, for example, right? So this hints at the general disjuncture between everyday realities on the ground and theoretical conceptualizations of decentralization and its purported benefits. Second point, arguments kind of suggesting that local level governance institutions would improve and root democracy in these spaces are met with critiques' counter arguments that it might in fact lead to inequalities within localities. Another scholar called Prof. Rani Malan, she argues that the lack of local capacity amongst illiterate and poor population groups might lead to local elite capture of public resources and an inability to implement central government programs. Decentralization amidst traditional patron-client relationship-based societies could result in the dominance of local elite or even richer farmers kind of dominating the policy realm, thereby impeding the participation of the beneficiaries of a lot of schemes, which are the poor and marginalized in policy decisions. In the Indian context, in addition to unequal access to bureaucratic officials and subsidies or schemes that other scholarly works have emphasized, we would need to also be kind of cognizant of unequal access to political decision-making owing to disparities arising from caste, class, and gender. Of course, I got a lot into this in my doctoral work, but I will kind of focus on the more policy side today. And this kind of signifies that there are overall several levels and hierarchies that must be accounted for in attempting to understand decentralization as a theoretical framework. It's crucial, therefore, to understand that decentralization is as decentralization does, and while there are many benefits associated with the approach, decentralization yields different results in different places. And although most scholars attribute this to the underlying structure and process of decentralization, these tend to fail to factor in the intranational variations that exist within countries and the importance of the context and the local level, right? So this is precisely where I situate my work, using decentralization as a theoretical framework, but then framing it within the local level to understand why policy sometimes does not work as intended. And building on Prof. Mullen's work again on decentralization, she argues that even within the term local, there is a homogenization which does not really consider individual decision-making. And more often than not, individual decision-making privileges the self over the communal or local good. It is thus more appropriate to ask whether the shift towards local government has actually mattered in average citizens' lives. And for this reason, the way that I have framed my research is to attempt to understand policy, not just from the top down, but also look at the reception of policies in the lives of farmers on the day-to-day. Now, briefly kind of getting into the methodology, I looked specifically at farmers' lives in Tamil Nadu, not just because, I'm familiar with the place or I speak the language, but also broadly because Tamil Nadu serves as a unique environment due to its geographical distance from the center that gives it a certain level of autonomy in how they implement their policies. And this then bodes well for talking about decentralization, because especially in terms of central policies, once the policy has been approved, funding is often transferred to the state for implementation. So this implementation is then open to interpretation and is conducted on the onus of the state and the state's capacity. The state of Tamil Nadu also presents an additional layer of complexity to decentralization processes, as irrigation sources are not evenly distributed across the state. So many of you might know, but tanks are mainly concentrated in southern districts which do not have access to perennial river sources like the Kaveri, and are therefore still quite heavily reliant on rainfall for irrigation. But given that the focus of this research is on groundwater extraction, the concentration of wells in the northern districts make it a narrower focus area for further analysis. So the districts chosen were as follows: so Chengalpat, Cuddalore, Tiruvallur, and Kanchipuram. And then quickly talking about the process itself, in order to understand decentralization or a trickle down of policies from the design to implementation to reception, field visits and interviews were conducted with government officials, business owners, business operators, large, small farmers, organic and chemical farmers as well. Interviews were conducted individually with all of these groups of people in a semi-structured manner and comprised of several open-ended questions. Field visits included visits to farms, farmers markets, government offices, think tanks, etc., to witness some of the work that they do in situ. And these field visits took place between August 2022 and February 2024. Right. So the micro-irrigation policy that I briefly mentioned earlier is the Pradhan Mantri Krishi Sinchai Yojana. Here on, I will call it PMKSY. It has the motto of Har Ke Ko Pani, which I hope I'm pronouncing right, but basically translates to water to every farm, which aims to reduce the occurrence of drought and flood. It's a centrally sponsored scheme on micro-irrigation, and a part of it seeks to popularize drip irrigation to ensure that there is more crop production and yield per drop of water, and also, of course, to ensure water security. However, my visits to farms in Tamil Nadu saw a lot of drip irrigation pipes that were strewn to the sides or shelved in sheds, and it would seem, therefore, that there is some kind of resistance or inability amongst farmers to take up government schemes, and this also then warrants closer scrutiny of the decentralization process. Now, at its outset, the central government has denoted that the program architecture of PMKSY will be to adopt a decentralized state-level planning and projectized execution structure that will allow states to draw up their own irrigation development plans. Immediately, this sets out the roles of the different levels of governments, with the center operating more as a source of funding or financing or monitoring. And it's further, of course, reiterated in the name of the scheme across all government documents pertaining to PMKSY as a centrally sponsored scheme on micro-irrigation. right? And the role of the state is then carved out to be one of execution and implementation based on the funding that's received from the center and the needs on the ground. And building on theories of decentralization that I covered earlier, this approach makes quite a bit of sense, as it is the decentralized levels that have a greater understanding of the needs on the ground. With the renaming of the scheme as per drop more crop in 2023, the institutional setup for implementation also evolved. It's now led by the National Stewardship Council under the chairmanship of the Secretary for the Department of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare. The council, of course, has representatives from the related ministries, but also has an allowance for special invitees who may be a representative from a micro-irrigation system manufacturing company, or a representative from maybe farmer producer organizations or farmers cooperatives or things like that. And this evolution reveals a greater inclusion of the stakeholders involved within the micro-irrigation implementation process, and a clearer structure that has emerged from the center to state, to micro-irrigation manufacturers, farmers groups, and so on. Of course, this structure tends to assume that all farmers' concerns are accounted for within farmers groups or cooperatives, but the evolution to include broader stakeholders reveals an attempt to enable policy trickle down, at least in structure. Now, in terms of implementation, closest to the ground level is the nodal department, which could be the state agriculture or horticulture department. It is also stipulated that all communication between Department of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare, Government of India, and state government would be preferably with and through the nodal department. Now, in Tamil Nadu, it is the Tamil Nadu Horticulture Development Agency under the Ministry of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare that is the nodal or implementing agency for this. And amongst the duties of this Horticulture Development Agency, a key one is actually publicizing the scheme at block and village levels and to raise awareness of the scheme among farmers. In doing so, they would then organize, say, district level seminars, workshops, etc., in conjunction with the micro-irrigation companies or manufacturers to kind of explain, what are the system components, what are their functions, what are the type of micro-irrigations for which crop, what are some of the post-installation services, and how frequently maintenance needs to be done and things like that. With all of these structures in place, it is no surprise that the operational guidelines of the scheme for 2023 highlight how the scheme is well accepted by the farmers and substantial coverage has been made under the micro-irrigation system, with states such as Tamil Nadu having the required infrastructures in place to be considered Category A states with comparatively better penetration of micro-irrigation technologies. Yet, when we go back to Mrs. Nachiamal's case, right? She had to stop farming for 10 to 12 years due to a lack of groundwater. When we draw back to that, it becomes apparent that there was, in fact, a scheme that could have helped lessen the severity of that situation. And while she did formally have access to the scheme, she did not take advantage of it, right? So let's explore in this next section why this is the case. So let's look at some of the implementation issues from the top down. So this is the rough organization chart of the agricultural department in Tamil Nadu based off of some interviews with agricultural officers from different districts. And as mentioned earlier, the nodal department is key to implementing policies. And in that same vein, the nodal officer is also key to do that. So let's just focus on the nodal officer for a second. So the nodal officer is a field level agricultural officer from the agriculture department who oversees 8 to 10 village panchayats. And every year, the directors in the department select 7 to 8 village panchayats to implement all of the current and past schemes in those villages. The next year, a new set of villages will be selected, and the villages from the previous year will not be focused on. For example, the nodal officer will help to, say, disseminate subsidies to the villages selected for the year, and he only has one opportunity to visit these villages in the year, collate all the schemes that the various families are eligible for, tell them how to utilize the schemes, and see that the schemes are disseminated to the farm families of that particular village panchayat. The nodal officer and his scope of needing to be aware of all the schemes in order to implement them when he's posted to those selected few villages for the year is not easy. Because for him to kind of collate the information on all the schemes, the nodal officer needs the senior staff across, the various hierarchies and departments to share the relevant information with him, the information and schemes with him. Yeah. However, this rarely happens and is usually due to two reasons. One, nodal officer is usually too junior in the hierarchy for senior officials across departments to engage with him or report to him about their schemes. Two, the various departments have their own planning schemes, targets, and methods of attaining those targets. As a result, they don't really share much information with the nodal officer, despite him being the designated ground level field staff to implement policies. One of the functions of the nodal officer is to get an understanding of challenges and problems on the ground. And one instance that I heard is that when a nodal officer asks villagers what problems they face, what help they might need, they tend to share, their need for irrigation tanks to be cleared, new water tanks to be installed, as well as other things like animal husbandry, medical help, and things like that, right? So such issues cannot be rectified or tended to by the nodal officer or the agriculture officer of the department. For the case of animal husbandry, medical help, the veterinary department also operates in that area with their own routine of vets who are dispatched to the villages once a week. Others might require the help of the agriculture engineering department for technical assistance. And offering any help or advice in this domain would be overstepping the jurisdiction of the agriculture department. And this kind of example emphasizes how the various departmental jurisdictions operate in quite a rigid structure, very much in silos, right? Now, the second main reason for the impracticality of the nodal officer's job scope is his own departmental work that he needs to complete, but is often too overburdened to do so. It's key to remember that while the nodal officer functions as an implementing officer on the ground, he also forms the root of the agricultural department. This means that he has his own protocol of work where he has to report to his superiors. He thus has to split his time between research in the village and doing everything that people expect and his own departmental duties and work. And, of course, we zeroed in on the nodal officer, but this issue is not only applicable to the nodal officer. Many other government officials or agricultural engineers also visit several villages to implement new schemes or install micro-irrigation systems and so on. And with the PMKSY and the micro-irrigation scheme, one of the biggest issues with the sustainability of the micro-irrigation system is the inherent risk of salinity clogging up the irrigation pipes. And this requires consistent post-installment maintenance and support. And while there are indeed guidelines that instruct micro-irrigation firms to extend their technical support for up to 3 years for maintenance, that is seldom followed. According to many officers, once they do, they go, nobody's asking. Government officers are busy in their own work. Only few officers come by because they're very busy with so many activities. And this complaint is not far from the truth, as officers are indeed busy with various issues such as farm maintenance, office work, reporting to their own superiors, attending meetings, and so on. And similarly, despite the kind of, as I mentioned earlier, right, I went during the cyclone, just before and after the cyclone Mandas, and I mentioned, and I was kind of talking to some of the agricultural officers about this, but interestingly, during and immediately after the cyclone, agricultural officers were focused on implementing another scheme called the PM Kisan scheme that some of you might be familiar with, rather than providing post-disaster relief to the farmers who were affected by the cyclone. Why? Because they had deadlines and forms that needed to be filled up by a certain date so that the center will release the installment funds for the PM Kisan scheme to go down to the farmers. So the issues of complex bureaucratic structures, competing jurisdictions, and overburdened administrative officials hamper the process of implementing and decentralizing the PMKSY scheme effectively. These then reflect on the ways that the scheme is received on the ground. So one of the issues that farmers face is even accessing and knowing about the scheme in the first place. As mentioned earlier, the nodal department conducts demos and visits to villages to share the scheme, but some farmers did not even know about the scheme, right? Mrs. Natramal, for example, she found it really difficult to access PMKSY. She shared that awareness of the scheme is limited in the village. In her case, if someone else in this village gets it, then I will know and I can approach them and get it. Otherwise, no, right? And a large part of this is also attributed to an element of luck, where finding out about policies and subsidies depends on our luck. And while there have been government visits to villages to raise awareness, some of the target villages also get left out because they are just so inaccessible and they prove quite impervious to reach. And so many farmers choose to use their own resources, tools, and informal networks rather than rely or wait for the state apparatus to bring a policy to them, right? So many farmers complain that, we have to put the rain hose to distribute water and we don't get help from the government. So we have to buy the hose from the market, which is not cheap. It was 2,000 rupees per hose. This despite there actually being help from the government to mitigate these costs. And from the lens of the farmer, accessing the schemes from a state level also proves easier than accessing central schemes. For example, in order to access a state scheme, farmers can put in their application to the assistant agricultural officer at the village level. State schemes are thus more accessible to the farmer at the village level, whereas central schemes like PMKSY are a little bit harder. So in order for farmers to approach the government office and find out about new central schemes or apply to adopt new schemes, they would need to travel quite a distance. Central schemes like the PMKSY require farmers to travel 40 to 60 kilometers to reach at least the district collector's office or the block level office. And government offices operate from 10 to 5 p.m. And farmers work on their fields from early morning till 12 noon or 1 p.m. And by the time the farmers leave their farms and reach the government offices, it's usually past 5 p.m. and the offices will be closed or they will be told to return the next day. Such logistical challenges prevent farmers from accessing officials or from accessing the scheme that the government is implementing. In this case, then, in terms of sustainability of agrarian livelihoods, it ends up being the case where those who can cultivate on a larger scale will survive, while the rest battle with worsening groundwater levels and climate fluctuations. And in that second point over there, the economic survey for 2017 to 18 by the Ministry of Finance, Government of India, highlighted that climate change will trigger an agrarian transition where to increase productivity and ensure prosperity, people must be moved out of agriculture. Farming cannot remain a viable livelihood, and the ultimate goal of agrarian policy must therefore be to ensure that tomorrow there are fewer farmers and farms, but more productive ones. And if this persists, rural smallholders will be edged out from the profession as large farmers are just better able to afford to invest in more productive technologies or partner with big conglomerates to guarantee profits, while small farmers face kind of unique challenges in that they have to cumulatively deal with instability of their livelihood and production, unremunerative prices for their produce, increasing input costs, lack of scale, decreasing availability of extension services, alongside all of the challenges in accessing mitigation schemes that I mentioned just now. And this then, brings me to my conclusion, where I just have two key points. The conclusion of the failure to factor in the nuances and diversity of farmers' experiences at the design and implementation stage tends to curtail the effectiveness of the decentralization process. And the sustainability of agriculture as livelihood seems more promising for rich, large farmers and not so much for the rural smallholder. And this then brings me back to where we began, the question that we started with, which brings, where we come back and where rural smallholders and small marginal farmers do not attempt to mitigate climatic fluctuations and groundwater levels because of the number of institutional challenges that they face in accessing the scheme. but also because of their need to privilege their individual short-term concerns of just earning enough to sustain their farm over and prioritizing that over long-term environmental concerns. And so that is where I will end off my presentation, and I look forward to hearing from your feedback.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murali. That was a fascinating deconstruction of actually existing policy processes and their development outcomes. And it's quite rare that that research is able to do both things. And also we take the importance of the local very seriously. I'd like to hand over now to Dr. Gopinath at MSSRF, who has experience in agrarian change and many other things, to act as the discussant. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Baba. And Vani, it's a very great presentation. So I do agree with your conclusion, but I differ with the way you project this micro irrigation scheme. Looks like a sole strategy as a mitigation factor for farmers to this climate change. See, one thing we should see from farmers' angle is what is the need. So, as you rightly said, that farmers differ in terms of not only the land ownership, other characteristics, but the type of crop they cultivate. And as far as Tamil Nadu is concerned, around 33% of lands are under paddy cultivation, where this micro irrigation is not that much workable to those kind of farmers. The other thing is, you see this decentralization process, and I feel the problem in implementing schemes by different departments is a major cause for this kind of things. Housing is a type of scheme where you get a limited allotment in each year, but still that housing for SC and ST and these economically weaker sections in this OBCs, it's somewhat comparably successfully implemented because the selection process is with the village level institutions, Panchayat Raj institutions, whereas these kind of schemes are not at all with those Panchayat Raj institutions. The officials, they do select these beneficiaries, which is influenced by various factors. So farmers really don't know whether they get this scheme or not, or some farmers, as you said, luckily get access to most of these schemes. So it's not properly decentralized at village level, particularly this kind of schemes. And I don't think that the experience of officials is a real problem. It's a problem with the design of selection process. And I'm not very much clear about the central scheme and state scheme, and I completely don't agree. I'm sorry, but completely don't agree with the traditional view of these government officials. They are working from 10 to 5 p.m. kind of things. Now we can see the government officials are working even 8 to 9 p.m. on a need basis during that crisis period. It's not only applicable to urban areas, but rural areas very much. And farmers used to upload their documents by 10 or 11 p.m. in the evening to get their crop insurance. So thing is how these schemes are designed, and we shouldn't see this kind of micro irrigation or irrigation saving mechanisms as a mitigation strategy by farmers. We have to see how this government handles this investment on major and medium level irrigations. So when we talk about decentralization process, it doesn't mean that we completely give to local authorities for maintenance and everything. It requires adequate financial support to reduce dependence on groundwater. When we say groundwater usage, again, it's completely a private investment, which can be done by only a capable people. When you go for more private investment, like groundwater, they will go for crops where they get higher income. We need not think about environmental friendly or climate change friendly kind of things there. So when we talk about this groundwater usage, we have to think, we have to discuss about this investment on major and medium, this thing. So these 3 points, and the planning process at village level is not happening like uniformly across states, particularly even in Tamil Nadu. We can see the government officials at block level or districts level, they do prepare this Gram Panchayat development plans and get approval from the panchayats. As you rightly mentioned that the Gram Panchayat level of your people are not adequately capacitated. So it has been beautifully designed, but the capacity of these Panchayat Raj institutions is not up to that level to judicially use their natural resources and also efficient to get all these government schemes to their Gram Panchayats. I think I can stop here and maybe I can come again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gopinath. Vani, would you like to reply to his comments? Because some of them are quite critical, and I think you need the opportunity to respond and justify.
I think we are quite in agreement with a number of things actually, which I maybe didn't say, but I saw in my study. And I kind of take the point on the need and the crop that is cultivated. Like you said, right, a lot of places are under paddy cultivation. Mrs. Nachamal's farm that I visited also was under paddy cultivation. And of course, micro irrigation does not work. So she she kind of turned away from the policy. And in that sense, then it also becomes, it ties back to the point on short term, right? So her main priority is then getting the money and not so much the environmental concerns. It's improving her yield, making her farm more productive and things like that. The other point that I wanted to build on is the financial support to, talk about private investment and things like that. I think another angle to kind of bring to this is also the legal framework. I spoke to some government officials and they were sharing that they wanted to ban the creation of new wells in Rameshwaram. But because of the local condition where, some people visit it for pilgrimage sites and things like that, and they're not able to ban it completely. And so it, beyond financial support, it also becomes a legal question of how enforceable some of these schemes are. And like you said, and I think I see in a question here on panchayat, role of panchayats. I think, as you rightly said, it comes down to the capacity that they are not up to level to use their natural resources, and they try to be as efficient as possible to get all the government schemes, but sometimes they are just unable to do so because of, and this goes back to the point on financial support. So yeah, maybe I'll just leave it at those 3 things.
Thank you very much. In the chat, we have a whole series of questions that you may have noticed. Rajesh raised the question of panchayat unions, which I think you've dealt with. Anonymous has asked a very interesting question. Is the real problem to do with centralization and decentralization, or is it a problem of policy implementation and how it happens on the ground and also how we study it? I wonder what you think about that question.
Yeah,
it's sort of outside the box of your research design.
No, absolutely. I think the way that I presented it was to kind of talk about the history of decentralization and the way that it was, it came up as a contrast to centralization. So maybe it didn't come out clearly, but it's not about centralization versus decentralization. It's about the process of decentralization and some of the implementation issues that come along with it. And of course, as this person rightly pointed out, the elite do know how to access the schemes. A lot of larger farmers are well connected to government officials, and they are well aware of how to access the schemes. So yeah, that's kind of definitely my scope of research as well.
But if it is the scope of your research, then there's an additional question which I might ask, which is that you have a theory of decentralization, but you don't have a theory of policy process or policy implementation, or at least what you're beginning to move towards, which is very interesting, is an institutional analysis from above and from below. And that's a contribution. But missing from it is an analysis of procedure and an analysis of the money trail. And Marcus has asked a question about the money trail, about the politics of subsidies, the political relations of different agrarian classes to access to subsidies, and the possibility that small farmers who can't navigate the system well enough may well have higher costs because they have to bribe. And then a whole new raft of intermediaries may appear. So thank you, Marcus, for that question, which kind of links the two questions so far together. How would you respond?
Yeah, I think I had a similar experience with my case study as well. I think this scheme is in Maharashtra, yeah. Yeah, and it's absolutely the case. A lot of farmers were telling me that they had to set aside an extra few thousand rupees in order to pay the bribes to get the process going. And not just bribes, but also things like food for the people working there, extra produce for the people working there, and things like that, right? So that's kind of, yeah, I think that's something that happens across as well. Just reading the question again. But yeah, I think another issue with this is also the fact of comprehending some of the subsidies. If you have a look at some of the clauses and the paperwork that is necessary to get some of these schemes, they are actually very nuanced and very complex to understand, even for me, as someone who's educated, right? So a lot of these policies were kind of, how many millimeters is the pipe, how much is the distance that you plan to put up in between the pipes, and all kinds of nuances within the questions that they were required to answer. And so I think bribes is a big issue, but it's also accessing the scheme in terms of how complex some of the paperwork and navigating the process, as you mentioned, also is.
Thank you. A number of questions can be, I think, reordered. Mm-hmm. I want to skip to Tanvi's question, which is about the intentionality of policy. Mm-hmm. And I suppose another way of expressing that is the appropriateness of the technology and the mode of distribution of hosing and micro precise irrigation. And that many policies will simply result in a Jevons paradox, where things get more efficient or cost goes down and the total demand will then go up. And she's making the observation that in the absence of proper groundwater regulation, and how on earth do you do that? That's another question. All technology simply aids a race to the bottom, a differentiation of agrarian society, which is what we concluded with. How do you respond to those questions?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. And I guess, like you said, how would you do groundwater regulation, honestly? And like I mentioned just now with the case study of Rameshwaram, it's proving to be quite difficult, even at the bureaucratic level. And of course, yeah, inevitable race to the bottom of the aquifer, where small farmers lose. Yeah, definitely. And I really saw this when I visited the ground. You really see how larger farmers are just better able to adapt to the technology. And I also saw, beyond the large and small farmer thing, I also saw that organic farmers were adapting better to this technology, more so than chemical farmers. And I haven't fully explored why, but I will hopefully get to that sometime soon.
Rajesh has a question from earlier in the list about the context, and that coincides with Govind's question about methods, field methods, sampling method, practical methods. How did you choose this area? Are there disincentives in the area that you studied for tank irrigation, for flood use of water? How scarce is water is Rajesh's basic question, above and below the ground. And how did that question affect your method, Govind's question? I think Yadareddy's question you've already answered, which was to do with centralization and decentralization. But could you take that bundle of questions now?
Okay, yeah.
About the context and how it and how your research design affected that, and vice versa.
If maybe I should have included that photo, but as I was kind of driving around some of the districts, I just saw huge pipes of water just pouring water out. And it begs the question of, it seems like there's actually so much water, but then when you look at the data, you don't get that, which then makes me question how deep these bore wells or wells are. And that's kind of where I began my analysis as well. And then I further understood that bore wells need not just be vertical, but they can also be horizontal. And so they kind of span quite a large area when trying to bring up water. There is kind of no disincentive for tanks per se. I think that is something that is a remnant of British rule. In India, a lot of the northern areas, because of the rivers around, they were incentivized to build wells, and that you still kind of see now. And in terms of methodology, like I mentioned at the start, I spoke to, I think, more than 20 over people in the different domains that I spoke to. So government officials, business people, farmer organizations, and then farmers itself. Yeah, and it was over quite a while. Also because this research began during COVID, so a lot of the initial processes were a little bit slow, but they kind of picked up after on.
Thank you. Quite a lot of questions you inspired from this presentation. There was a clarification from Yadareddy that his concern about centralization, so that the question is slightly different from the first question that kicked us off, is about accountability and transparency during the process of implementation of policy. And that's chiming in with another contribution from Anonymous, who's saying that decentralization can take many different forms, and that you haven't really unpacked the different forms. It can be managerial, or it can be democratic and disputatious. What kind of decentralization is the theory of decentralization focusing on? And that matters to your concern about locality. Yes, I'll leave it there because there are a whole slew of other questions, but I'll take them in turn. So how about Anonymous and Yadareddy's question about the nature of decentralization?
Yeah, sure. And I think that the point on commodity distribution is actually a good one as well to address, because one of the first few things that I saw when I went to visit these places is that a lot of people were actually using groundwater not just for agriculture, but they were also using it to fill up water for bottling companies. And that kind of adds on to that commodity distribution point as well, right? So in that sense, and it comes back to Dr. Gopinath's point on prioritizing profit over environment, pretty much, right? And then in terms of framing of decentralization, I think one of the terms that I used quite a bit when doing this research was the trickle down of the process, which I didn't use very much today, but basically that's kind of what I meant. So looking, I think you mean it in the first bit on managerial, managing local resources, but also managing the implementation of schemes, and just kind of seeing how it then goes down the train, right? What I did not look at is looking at democratic participation, just because for me, I wanted to look at it more from a public policy angle to see what worked and what didn't, what made the process effective or ineffective. And yeah, I didn't really go into, who was involved in the decision-making process or, the local participation in the process. And I didn't do this because, like I mentioned, I began this research during COVID. And so I was a bit unsure about the number of people who I would be able to get to speak to me on these issues. So maybe that's just something for future consideration. Thank you.
Thanks. Another question which responds to Govind's plea for more about your method is coming from Anon, who's saying, what other uses of water apart from groundwater are being made in your locality? And he's, I think, thinking about tanks and canals. How relatively important is groundwater and therefore this scheme in the great panoply of water management technologies?
I mean, when I was doing my study, I kind of focused on the northern bit of Tamil Nadu. So of course, there's tanks, canals, rainwater, and rivers, of course, to kind of help with irrigation. I didn't really go into those, which, yeah, I guess begs the question of then how much do you need this scheme? But I think the bigger issue that was alarming for me is how deep these wells were when I did visit some of these farms. So I saw not just in northern Tamil Nadu, but also in southern parts of Tamil Nadu, where you would see wells go down pretty deep. I mean, I have the data elsewhere, but the numbers are quite astounding in how deep some of these wells and bore wells go, and the fact that some of these figures are just increasing in terms of depth. And that's kind of what made me want to look into this issue vis-a-vis other practices used for irrigation.
Thanks. I don't know how much time we're going to be allowed, but there are several more questions, and perhaps in view of time, I'll just ask them all. Judith Hare asks a question which follows on from your answer, which is about subsidies and whether the same effect could be achieved at far lower cost by phasing out the electricity subsidy or repurposing the electricity subsidy. Dr. Yadareddy also has an additional question, which is very interesting. It's about the spatiality of the project and the relationship between land relations and property on the one hand, and the rather networked relations or irrigation infrastructure on the other. I think I haven't missed any out. So I wonder if you have time to respond briefly to those.
Yeah, absolutely. that's interesting because electricity for farmers and agricultural use is free in Tamil Nadu. And a lot of people have talked about how, that's a big issue and that's what's causing such groundwater depletion. And so this is the most logical conclusion, right? Why don't you just increase the electricity charges? But then, one of the conclusions of this presentation was that smallholders will get edged out of agriculture, right? And some of the smallholders and the small farmers that I spoke to, including Mrs. Natjamal, by the way, who has 5 acres of owned land and 5 acres of rented land, she also told me that, and to quote, if they put a charge on electricity, we would die. To put it quite bluntly, because it would just become extremely unaffordable for a lot of people to continue with this livelihood. And that's just something that you need to factor in. And I'm saying this from a policy point of view, but there's also, of course, political implications to this, right? For example, a lot of these farmers are electorate. And so if you kind of remove this subsidy, then who's going to vote for you, right? So that's also something that will inevitably cross their minds. And this thing on electricity was something that was said to me before the last election. So they were quite concerned already at that time with maybe they might take away the subsidy. But thankfully, I guess they didn't. But the implications of even a small increase in electricity charges is going to be quite robust for them. And that's just something that we need to also factor in.
Thank you. 2 last questions from Aparna, who wants to follow up something that you said about water being used not only for agriculture, but also for bottling. In the part of Tamil Nadu that you did field work in, there is an additional competition for use from industries. Did that affect agrarian economy? It's more a comment than a question, but how was that at all influential in the conceiving and the implementation of the scheme? The possible demand not just for drinking or for the commodification of drinking in bottle form, but also industry in relation to agriculture.
I think that's something that came up after the fact. A lot of people were realizing after the implementation of this scheme that actually groundwater is not only used for agriculture, it's used also for other things like bottling. And, I didn't really see industries compete for water per se. But I mean, I'm sure it will affect the supply of, groundwater inevitably. Interesting thing though, that a lot of people would, especially to come back to Mrs. Najamal actually, was telling me was, agriculture is a livelihood that's very difficult. And, people don't seem to understand how difficult exactly it is. And if now some big business or the government wants to build a highway or something across my farm, I would gladly say yes, because I would be happy to take the compensation and retire. And I think, that kind of tells you, that maybe the agrarian economy is kind of changing a little bit. It's that it's a little bit tired, especially for some more than others. And of course, I'm not advocating for industry to just take over their farmland, but in their own words, it may help alleviate some of their costs. So I guess, like you said, it's just a comment. I'm not really fully answering the question, but just leaving something for people to think about, I suppose.
Okay, and the very final one comes from Anonymous, who's saying, who's querying the use of the latest paradigm shifts and academic fads to frame research. And you could also apply that to the framing of policy. And the meat of the question is it not the case that farmers have been mitigating and adapting for decades? Is there a history to it? And I'd like to add my pennyworth to that question, which is there no path dependence in policies for water management? Doesn't water management go back, even with well irrigation, at least to the 70s with the World Bank and spacing regulations and the water table declining? So what about history in your research and in the design of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to kind of get to that quickly, the history element is very important. And I didn't touch on it today because it's a lot to cover. And I only had 30 minutes. So, but what I will say is that, you know, the way that I looked at history and some of the archival material that I looked at, you actually get quite a promising view of decentralization in the past. And you kind of also see that, you know, during the push to, you know, achieve self-sufficiency, post-independence, and all kinds of things like that, there was a lot of emphasis on improving productivity, right? And in doing so, actually, one of the reports, the administrative reports on Tamil Nadu actually mentioned that by the late 70s, surface water and groundwater had depleted quite a lot already, right? And so it's not something new that I'm pitching here, but the point that I'm getting at is, you know, with the policy implementation bit and then trying to mitigate the already dire circumstances of groundwater extraction.
Okay, so it's a question of you're focusing in on one policy, but there being a history of policies behind it. And then the question is the extent of non-policy factors versus policy factors. But I think that's a bit broader. And I think that we ought to draw this to a close, although clearly it's interested a large number of participants. And thank you very much, everybody, for all the questions. Thank you, Dr. Gopinath and Dr. Murali. And I'll hand back to the foundation to finally wrap up this very interesting seminar.
Thank you, Professor Barbara. Before proceeding, we sincerely apologize for the technical difficulties we faced during today's seminar. Now, before we wrap up, I would like to take a moment to extend our sincere gratitude. On behalf of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, I would like to express our appreciation to our speaker, Dr. Vani Swarupa Murali, for her engaging and insightful presentation. Her perspectives have contributed to a rich and stimulating discussion. We are also grateful to our discussant, Dr. Gopinath R., for expertly moderating the session and for his valuable contributions to this engaging discussion. Our sincere thanks to Professor Barbara Harris-White for chairing this session and for her continued support in shaping this seminar series. Her contributions have been invaluable in expanding its scope. A special acknowledgement to the FAS online team, Sandeepan, Setu, and Tapas, for their efficient coordination and efforts in ensuring the seamless conduct of this seminar. We also extend our gratitude to Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung South Asia for their support, which has made this series possible. Finally, a big thank you to all our attendees for your engagement and participation, which made this session all the more enriching. The recording of this session will soon be available on YouTube. To learn more about the Foundation for Agrarian Studies and our work, please visit our website at fas.org.in. We are active on social media, and you can find us at FAS Agri Studies on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I request that you follow us on all these platforms to stay updated on this seminar series as well as our other initiatives. With this, we conclude today's session. Once again, thank you for all your valuable time and participation.